It is, however, a great pleasure to be able to talk about what is the most important subject in the whole world. And the most important subject in the entire world is the question of the national rejuvenation of China and its relationship to the fate of humanity. Because I want to explain that these two are inseparably connected. Not that China has to subordinate its interests to the general interests of humanity, but that China, by pursuing its own national rejuvenation, is also able to take a gigantic step forward, not only for its own country, but for the entire world. And I want to explain that. And for that reason, I cannot think of any greater privilege than to be able to speak to an audience of young people in China, because I mean it very sincerely, that it is on the young people in China that the whole future of their own country depends, and on which the whole future, in a way I want to explain, of humanity depends. I am not a person who makes compliments for the sake of it. I'm rather cautious and precise, and I want to therefore explain in this lecture why these words that I mean are meant absolutely seriously, and I hope you will understand that by the time that we get to the end. However, what I want to explain is that the ruthlessness of House of Cards is nothing compared to the ruthlessness of the real politicians who carry out actions against China, in particular of the US neocons. Because in House of Cards, they kill one people or two people, or maybe five, I can't remember exactly how many people are killed, but it's not very many. And they engage in conspiracies against each other and so on. But the people who've run this neocon policy in the United States have killed millions of people. House of Cards is nothing compared to what their policies are. That's why I chose the article. Western policy is much more ruthless than anything you will see in House of Cards. They invaded whole countries, and destroyed them, such as Iraq or Libya. They created the problem of Islamic terrorists. Before the invasion of Iraq, Islamic terrorists were a very unpleasant and reactionary group of people who had no power in Iraq. After the invasion, they control large parts of Iraq, etc. And something that particularly affects you is these people have to prevent China achieving prosperity. That is, the Chinese people, they have to stop the Chinese people achieving the best possible standard of living in China. Not merely all the aspects of national rejuvenation in China, but the most simple of all, which is the desire of people to live as well as they can, to live as long as they can, to be as happy as they can, to bring their children up as well as they can. And I want to explain why they have to try to stop this, and why this is deeply reactionary. What does the United States present itself as supporting? Let's look at the negative, US policy. It says it supports democracy and human rights. It says it wants China to succeed. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to examine the facts. And the fact is, these statements are not true. US foreign policy, in particular US neocon foreign policy, is not based on support for democracy, as the facts will show. It is based upon whether a country supports or does not support the policy of the United States. In particular, it is a question that the United States foreign policy, particularly neocons, has a simple goal, which it says, which is the United States must be the most powerful country in the world, and therefore your foreign policy has to be to support the position of the United States as the first most important country in the world. This is the reality, and I'm going to show you what this reality is. What experience am I going to draw on for this? Well, I have a difference to the other people in this room because I was born in the West. Therefore, I've lived all my life in the West, and I understand it more directly than people in China, and this gives me advantage to understand some things. Secondly, I worked for 8 years in Russia from 1992, and I saw a national catastrophe. One of the things that most concerns me is I do not want to see occur in China what I witnessed with my own eyes in Russia, which I'm going to describe later, which is one of the greatest geopolitical catastrophes in history. As Vladimir Putin quite right put it, as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Russia went from a state which led a country of over 250 million people to a country with only 142 million people because of the victory of separatism. Russia's economy experienced the biggest fall in peacetime since the Industrial Revolution. Its economy declined by 40%. Male life expectancy in Russia fell to 58 years, fell by 6 years. Civil wars developed in Russia, in Azerbaijan, in Ukraine, in Chechnya, etc. This was a national catastrophe. I saw that with my own eyes. I saw things which still haunt me to this day, which is to see people, to see old-age pensioners who had fought Nazism in Germany, who fought during the Second World War, in the great anti-fascist war, when Russia lost 27 million people, standing on the streets of Moscow, selling a single cigarette because they were so poor, and to have even any money at all, that was what they were trying to sell. Not even a packet of cigarettes, one cigarette. And I saw that with my own eyes, and those images will never leave me during my whole life. And that had a profound experience of me. If I'm going to describe, if you like, Russia from the negative, because I hope that China will be the example from the positive. Finally, I've been writing on China's economy. I started studying China's economy in 1978. But I wrote my first big article on the Chinese economy in 1992. This is 24 years ago, so I haven't discovered China, last week. The title of that article was called "Why the Economic Reform Will Succeed in China and Fail in Russia." The analysis of that was very clear and follows from the title. It believed at that time that China's economic growth would be the greatest economic growth in human history, and it would be a gigantic success, and the policies that were put forward by Western economists in Russia, so-called shock therapy, would be a catastrophe. And that view was a huge international fight, particularly amongst Western economics. China, fortunately not, because China pursued its own course. I have seen nothing in that 24 years that changes that opinion. The success of China's economic reform. I know now more detail because, of course, I have the great privilege to work with my colleagues in Chonyang Institute day by day, so for the last 3 years. So I learn a lot more about the Chinese economy, but I have not altered my fundamental views about that. When there was the anniversary of the birth of Deng Xiaoping, I was asked to write an article, and I chose the title of the article, and I wrote the article called "Deng Xiaoping, the World's Greatest Economist." And I don't mean by that the most important thing about Deng Xiaoping was that he was an economist. Obviously it wasn't. The most important thing about Deng Xiaoping was that he was a great leader of the Chinese people. But nevertheless, amongst his other great virtues, Deng Xiaoping was the world's greatest economist. By which I mean, not merely from a theoretical point of view, but the success of the Chinese economy is unmatched in world history. Now, what I want to explain, what is the most fundamental contradiction in the world situation today, for reasons I want to explain, that is between the national regeneration of China, that is not merely in the interest of the people of China, but China is 1/5 of humanity. It represents a gigantic step forward for humanity, the national regeneration of China, versus the attempts of not the American people. Don't talk about the United States. I have many, many American friends who, many of them don't agree with the policies of the neocons in the United States, but the people who I will call the neocons in the United States. That is the main contradiction in the world today. How does this develop? This shows you the astonishing achievement of China. And this is something which even China's statistics don't do, because China adopts not a very good way of categorizing its position in the world. It takes a list of countries and says, you know, China comes 68th or 69th or something out of the list of all countries. But that's a misleading way of doing it, because that means that Monaco, which has a population of 80,000 and certainly has a higher GDP per capita than China, is counted the same as India, which has a population of 1.1 billion and has a lower GDP per capita in China. So the most accurate way to do it, as I've done it on this chart, is to take it by population. And you can see what has happened in that, which is China went in 1949 and then in 1978 from being one of the poorest countries in the world. In fact, in 1949, there were only 10 countries in the world that were poorer than China, because China had been devastated by 100 years of invasions, wars, foreign oppression, etc. That was the situation then, to a situation where now only 30% of the population of the world has a higher GDP per capita than China, and China has a higher GDP per capita than the majority of the world's population. And there has never been such an improvement in the position of people in the world in the whole of human history. You have to understand that. Because sometimes I become depressed that China it understates things. I am not in favor of exaggeration. Boasting, exaggeration gets you nowhere. There is no virtue in optimism. There is no virtue in pessimism. There is only a virtue in realism. China's economic development is unparalleled in the whole of human history. Let me give you examples of that. The first country in the world ever to experience rapid economic growth was Britain at the time of the Industrial Revolution. This was 2% of the world's population, and their living standards improved greatly. The second major country to undergo great rapid economic growth was the United States after the US Civil War. This was 3% of the world's population. From 1929 onwards, the Soviet Union underwent very rapid economic growth. This was 8% of the world's population. You can already see why the Russian Revolution and the industrialization of the Soviet Union had such a great impact, because it was almost 3 times as big as any country which had ever had economic growth before. But China, when it started its rapid economic growth in 1978, was 22% of the world's population. Almost 4 times the population of the United States when it started its rapid growth. Almost 3 times the population of the Soviet Union when it started growth. Never in the whole of human history has the lives of so many people been improved so much and so quickly. That is it. When I say China's is the greatest economic achievement in the whole of human history, it's not to be polite. It's just that this is a fact. I'm going to talk about the policy of the US neocons. It's very important to understand that it is not interesting or necessary to work out what is in their heads. I have no idea what is in their heads. I only think about what is the objective content of their policy. And the objective content of their policy is that the United States must remain the most powerful country in the world, regardless of the consequences for everybody else. And regardless of the consequences for everybody else, at the moment means, in particular, regardless of the consequences for China. So therefore, it's not important to work out what is in their head. What is important to know is what is the context of their policy. Why do they have to prevent China achieving prosperity? It's a simple question of arithmetic. The population of China is more than 4 times the population of the United States. This means that when China's GDP per capita becomes 23% that of the United States, China's economy becomes as large as the economy of the United States. It means that when China's per capita GDP became half that of the United States, which is still inadequate from the point of view of China achieving the highest living standards in the world, China's GDP would be twice the size of the United States, and China would become the most powerful country in the world. This is not a problem, actually, for humanity. In fact, this is the biggest step forward for China that could be imagined for humanity. Again, let's do a little arithmetic. Taking the World Bank definition of what is a high-income economy, which is just about over $12,000 per year per capita GDP, at the present time, 19.2% of the world's population lives in such economies. So let's call it 19%. Right. China is by itself 18.9% of the world's population. Again, 19%. In other words, the population of China is essentially the same as that of the whole population of the world, which lives in high-income economies. But China is very close to becoming a high-income economy by World Bank standards. China has its own criteria, which is moderate prosperity in a comprehensive way, which is to be achieved by 2020. Okay, this is China's criteria. I'll help it by using World Bank criteria, of the international one. It's just a little bit higher. It means that China might just achieve this by 2020 if it grows very quickly. If not, it'll achieve it about 2021, 2022. So China is very close to being high-income economy. Can you imagine what a wonderful thing this is for the world? The number of people who are living in high-income economies will double. This is not only great for China, this is absolutely great for the entire world. What a step forward that can be taken, right? And it's not merely a good thing in the sense that people can look at it and say, oh, it's great, China's doing very well, we applaud very much, which I know when I teach students from Africa or Latin America they do. This is going to create many possibilities for other countries, because economics is not a zero-sum game. One of the most fundamental rules of economics, which is very nice, is that 1 plus 1 can be more than 2. By which I mean the most powerful force of economic development is division of labour, socialisation of labour. This means that if two countries cooperate, they can produce a bigger output than either of the countries separately and added up. So therefore, the possibilities that for China's development that will be created for other countries are enormous. You can already saw that in talks and other things that are already happening for China in Southeast Asia. But if you take One Belt, One Road, for example, it means that China is spreading its prosperity out into other countries. So this is great for the world. But of course, for the US neocons, this is not a good thing. This is a disaster. Because it means China becoming prosperous means that China will become, or rather the United States will no longer be the world's most powerful country. And by their definition, that's a disaster. I don't care. Britain is not going to be the most powerful country in the world, I can assure you. I don't really care. From the point of view of humanity, it's not important. What is important is the general interests which occur from the situation of humanity. Now, what I want to look at is the methods that the United States uses, or the US neocons in particular. And again, when I mean US here, in order to avoid it, I'm talking about its official foreign policy, its official policy. I don't mean the US people who have quite different interests in it. Let's firstly look at, to show that what they claim is the case is untrue. Let's take, for example, claim that what US policy is based on is democracy. Well, let me take your country. I'll take the country of Saudi Arabia. In Saudi Arabia, nobody has a vote. All political parties are banned. Women are not allowed to drive cars. Women are not allowed to travel without the permission of male relatives. Can you imagine this was Chinese women going to accept that they can't drive, that they can't travel without male relatives? This is totally undemocratic. Do you see, you would expect if the US foreign policy were based upon democracy and human rights, you would see a gigantic campaign carried on in the media against Saudi Arabia. None. Why? Because Saudi Arabia supports the United States. Take Bahrain. Bahrain is a country in which there is, again, an absolutist monarchy. The majority of the population is of a different branch of Islam to the ruling family. It has great repression. Why? Do you see great campaign carried out by the United States foreign policy against Bahrain? No. Why? Because the US has a fleet base there. Let's take another example, Hong Kong. Last year there was a big fuss over the question of the election of the, how you elect the governor of Hong Kong. The United States made a noise. Britain ruled Hong Kong for 150 years and never allowed the election of the governor of Hong Kong in any way at all for 150 years. But there were no complaints which came out of US foreign policy. Only when Hong Kong returned to China did we find complaints about this coming. This again shows that this policy was hypocrisy. Another one, they're based on a fake concept of human rights. And this is something about which I've written a lot. Human beings have very many needs. They're very complicated things. These range from the most basic. I'm afraid for a lot of people in the world, the most important thing is to have enough to eat, to escape from poverty. China has raised 728 million people from poverty. That is the greatest contribution to human rights in the entire world, because I can assure you that nobody who is living in poverty is free. They don't have real choices. You take it, for example, a situation of child. If you're grown up as a child, you never grow to be the proper height you should be. You grow up with problems in your bones. You grow up with health. You die 7 or 9 years younger than you need to. Your human rights are no good under those circumstances. Others, fortunately, they then get when we advance from this, they need personal security. They want to pursue their own national way of life, not be dictated how they should live to. They want to pursue culture. They want to pursue science. There's this huge range of real human needs. But what the US chooses farcical concept of human rights is that it's about the question of whether you can use Facebook or not, or whether you can have parliamentary form of republic to decide policy. This is a ridiculous concept of human rights. An example to show you that. Let's take a comparison. The famous thing, women hold up half the sky. Well, let's be precise. Let's take the two biggest groups of women in the world, which is Chinese women and Indian women. And don't forget that Chinese women and Indian women, make up 1/5 of the world's population. A Chinese woman lives 9 years longer than an Indian woman. A Chinese woman is 93% likely to be literate. An Indian woman lives 9 years less. She has 1/3 chance not to be able to read and write. She has a 40% chance her children will be stunted because they're poor. 700 million people in India do not even have a toilet in their house. Do you think that the rights of an Indian woman, human rights of Indian women, are as good as the rights of a Chinese woman? You tell the women of India that they could live 9 years longer, read and write, and not have their children be brought up in poverty, and they were allowed to emigrate to China, I assure you several 100 million people would quickly go north of the Himalayas. Why do we have this farcical concept, this misrepresentation of human rights? As I said, China lifting 728 million people out of poverty, and the whole of the rest of the world, incidentally, only achieved 152 million. 83% of the reduction of poverty in the world is due to China. Right. Why do you have this? Because, as the French philosopher Etienne Balibar liked to put it, so let's go from the myth about the Western policy to real Western policy now. It was very well put by a French philosopher, Etienne Balibar, who said that the reason that the West so much objects to the use of the term in Marxism of the dictatorship of the proletariat because it wants to conceal the dictatorship of capital. And the real system which exists in the West is exactly the dictatorship of capital, with just a mask on it. And I will then go through you again to explain this from the point of view of facts. This mask, we can have soft forms of this mask. The soft, because people don't like to expose things too much. Do it carefully, right? In the US, you can see it in the present presidential election and in all presidential elections. Here, control of capital is controlled by money. You need billions of dollars to be a candidate in the US presidential election. And capital makes sure the money goes to the people it favours. Again, we take, for example, Hillary and Bill Clinton. $153 million paid by companies for Wall Street and American companies for speaking by Bill and Hillary Clinton. Well, I've heard some very good speakers in my time, but I've never heard anybody who was worth $153 million for delivering speeches. That was not speech. That is a way to get money to people in disguised form. In the US Democratic primary election, people think that it's run just by people voting. Not true. There are 712 delegates who are not elected by anybody. They're what are called superdelegates. And why were they put there? They were put there to make sure that Bernie Sanders isn't defeated by Hillary Clinton. It's very simple. They are to stop any democratic choice of the US presidential candidate. Right. In the worst, when there were more social terrible conditions, of course you've had even more things, because there is unfortunately a history of political assassination in the United States. Several leading figures in the American political system, Martin Luther King, for example, were assassinated. At the moment, tensions are not so high. This is not happening, right? But that's what we may say is in the US systems. The dictatorship of capital is disguised and it's controlled by putting money. Right, now in some cases, things are not quite so much under control. And more radical methods have to be used. People I know in China were listened to, again I wrote a lot about it, it's happened in my country, the Brexit referendum in Britain. And they said, well, Britain's voted to join the EU. I was on television and said, no. Don't think that the vote decides anything. There have already been 4 referendums in the European Union which have already been overturned. Denmark voted against the Treaty of Maastricht. Maastricht Treaty is the treaty which creates the euro. That created a big problem because under EU legislation, every country has to vote in favour. So what was happened? A huge campaign, a few tiny little changes, take the referendum a year later, you've got the result you wanted, the referendum's overturned. When Sweden joined the European Union, it joined on the basis that it was going to join the euro. But unfortunately, the Swedish population then voted not to accept the euro. But instead of the European Union saying, oh, well, it's very unfortunate you're not going to accept the euro, so now you're out of the European Union, they said, oh, well, Sweden is still theoretically committed to the question of having the euro, so Sweden can stay in the European Union. In 2005, there was an attempt to introduce a European constitution. There was a referendum in France, because on this, which voted against the European constitution. So what it was done, instead the provisions of the European Union constitution were put in a treaty, the Treaty of Lisbon, and a treaty doesn't have to have a referendum on it. So instead of it, the referendum was reversed by putting all the provisions of it into a treaty, or the main provisions. Okay. In 2008, Ireland, which did have a referendum on the treaty, voted against the treaty. So again, what happened? Huge campaign, big fuss, big thing, take a referendum, overturn it, and you get reverse the change. So in other words, if the Brexit referendum is overturned, it'll merely be the 5th referendum in Europe that's already been overturned. So please don't believe that because Britain has voted in a referendum for Brexit, that necessarily means that Brexit is going to take place. This is in Europe, the social tensions a bit more, so you have to use more open means than is used in the United States. But this is, of course, not the worst. In developing countries, such methods, even as overturning referendums, won't work. There you have to have brutal force. And so there is a whole history of support for military coups d'etats, invasions, and so on and so forth. I've just taken some on this screen, some of the most famous. In the early 1950s, the United States arranged a coup d'etat to overthrow Mossadegh, who was the elected leader of Iran, because he wanted to control Iran's oil resources. In 1973, the United States organized a military coup to overthrow and kill Salvador Allende, who was the president of Chile, who was a sort of mild socialist. Wars, Vietnam, 1 million people killed by the United States invading Vietnam. Iraq, invasion of Iraq leading to chaos, which is continuing to this day. The whole world is paying for Iraq, and incidentally, my continent, Europe, is particularly paying for it because the terrorists who were previously powerless have now become powerful in countries like Iraq, Syria, and Libya, and are letting off bombs in Europe. Mainly, I'm worried about that, more than 100,000 people in Iraq were killed, but the Europeans are paying a price as well for this policy. Libya has exactly the same type of policies. So these are so if overturning referendums won't work, or if money won't work, then you can use more brutal means. But this is the big difference for the United States with China. China is too big, too powerful. It cannot be murdered, as I put it. It has a privilege which Iraq doesn't have, or Chile didn't have. Not even the most crazy American neocon at the present time proposes a war with China. That is, China cannot be murdered. So they have to, as I put it, try to persuade China to commit suicide. Now, this might sound crazy. How can you persuade a country to commit suicide? But I'm afraid the US has some success in this. The best example of this was, of course, the one which happened in Russia. In Russia, you had a totally confused person, Gorbachev, who was used by the United States to create political chaos in the country and support people like Yeltsin, and imposed upon Russia, not by military defeat. Russia had enormously strong military forces, but by political confusion and disorganization, a gigantic social catastrophe, as I outlined with you. The biggest economic collapse since the Industrial Revolution, the victory of separatism, etc. It's important to understand there, because I was there. I knew this catastrophe was going to occur, and that's why I went there. They were very naive. They believed that if they were not hostile to the United States, if they were friendly to the United States would be friendly by them. It's like trying to be friends with a wolf, right? All they did was they promoted separatism in Ukraine, in the Baltic states, in Central Asia. They brought NATO to the borders of Russia, despite the fact they promised they didn't to. They overturned Russia's allies in Syria, Iraq, Libya, or other. Now, do you know what all my Russian friends say? They tell me, you were right. But the problem is, it's too late. I'm very pleased to see the friendship developing between Russia and China. This is good. I hope they succeed. But it's going to be very, very hard because the catastrophe has taken place. And what I don't want, the biggest fear I ever have, is in 10 years' time, my Chinese friends say to me, John, you were right. Tibet has been taken from China. Taiwan province has been taken from China. Xinjiang has been taken from China. Hong Kong has been taken from China. The Chinese economy has fallen. John, you were right. I don't want that. I want what I saw with my own eyes, the catastrophe in Russia, to be the opposite. I would be very lucky I'm not a romantic person. I don't believe in Hollywood films. I don't believe that everything has a happy ending. The difference is the Chinese people can. They have not suffered the national catastrophe. They can stop it happening. And in this case, I want a Hollywood ending. I want, when I'm 10 years' time dying, or with my children around me, etc., to think that China succeeded. China did not make these mistakes. China took this great step forward, not only for its own country, for its humanity, but for humanity. Another example I want to deal with is why you can persuade countries to commit suicide not only geopolitically, but you have to do it economically. But I want to explain why the US has to slow down China's economy. It's because a presentation sometimes appeared in some media in China, which is very misleading. It says the US economy is very dynamic, the US economy is growing very quickly. It's not true. That's why I've put this graph up to show you. The US economy has been slowing down for 50 years. Don't get me wrong, I don't believe it's going to collapse or anything. I don't believe there's going to be a new 1929 or anything of this type. But the US economy has been slowing for 50 years. Its growth rate is 2.4%. It cannot defeat China by making the US economy grow quickly. The only way that the US can remain more powerful than China is to slow down China's economy. And it did do it to other countries. In the 1970s, the United States slowed Germany's economy. It slowed Japan's economy. In the 1990s, it used the debt crisis in East Asia to slow South Korea and the Asian tigers. Now it wants to slow China's economy. And this I do object to. Why? Because it means that the Chinese people will not achieve prosperity. It is wonderful, the achievements that China's economy has made. As I said, it is the greatest economic achievement in human history. And again, personally, the first time I came to China, I was in the municipal hall in Shanghai, and I saw a picture of Deng Xiaoping and his visit to Shanghai, and tears came in my eyes, because I knew what that person represented from the point of their achievements for so many people in China, and therefore for so many people in the world. That task has had a gigantic beginning, and China is close to prosperity, but it still needs to develop for 10, 20 years there. And the attempt to slow down the Chinese economy in the interest of the United States means that the policy of the neocons is essentially that the Chinese people must never achieve prosperity. And as a member of the human race, I do thoroughly object to that proposal. I've got my own reasons, and people in China have got even more reasons for opposing it than I do. Let's therefore look at what China achieved. I am a supporter of the economic policies of Deng Xiaoping. I already told you the article I wrote, Deng Xiaoping, the world's greatest economist. I'm not a supporter of the planned economy of China prior to 1978. But I want to tell you one thing, the social achievements of China in 1949 to 1976 and 1978 are also the greatest in human history. And I mean that, again, without any exaggeration, because I studied it. It's well known to economists that the single best indicator of overall well-being is average life expectancy, because average life expectancy sums up all the things which are good, all the things which are bad, and shows you them in a single figure. In China, in 1949 until 1978, China's life expectancy increased by 32 years in a 29-year period. There has never been anything like that in human history before. Right, and I studied them. I know there are other times, Britain in the latter half of the 19th century, the US after the Civil War. China is almost twice as fast. This is why the theory of historical nihilism, the attempts to say that what occurred in China before the death of Mao Zedong or something, is wrong, is pure nonsense. and very disgusting nonsense, because the social improvement in that period is the greatest in the whole of human history. And again, I repeat, I say that as somebody who supports the economic policies of Deng Xiaoping, not the economic policies that were pursued then, but you've got to be objective about what was achieved in that period, right? China's economic growth from 1978 to 2015, 9.7%, is the fastest ever recorded by a major economy in human history. China has the fastest rise in consumption, that is the material basis of living standards, of any country. And again, still my favourite policy, my favourite point is what it means for the world that China took 728 million people out of poverty and the whole of the rest of the world took only 152 million, which incidentally shows the nonsense that it's the claim that capitalism in China, which has made its achievements. If capitalism was what took people out of poverty, the biggest increase in taking people out of poverty wouldn't be in China, it would be in the rest of the world. But it's China, a socialist country, which accounts for 83% of the reduction of poverty. It's socialism which gets people out of poverty, not capitalism, and produces the most rapid growth in the world. Right. This then leads to what I experience in some sort of psychological drama, and I can feel it, and I know it's a discussion in China. I sometimes say, I feel like saying, please China, please wake up. Just understand how gigantic your achievements are. Let me give you a little example. I wrote an article of which I put the title is, China has the best record contribution to human rights of any country in the world. And do you know that no Chinese media would publish it with that title? They wanted to put titles like, China has made a very big contribution to human rights. Or one did put it, they put, China's got the biggest contribution to human rights, but they insisted on putting a question mark after it. I didn't have any question mark in the headline I put. And again, I'm not saying this to attack the media, it's some lack of self-confidence. And I want to say that modesty in individual human beings is great virtue. But as I said, there is no virtue in being modest from the point of view when you're dealing with very big, serious questions. There is no virtue in being pessimistic. There is no virtue in being optimistic. There is only a virtue in being realistic. If I say that China is the greatest achievement in human rights of any country in the world, it's because I've studied the other countries, and I mean exactly that. And I don't mean that it's very good, and I don't put a question mark after it. It means that I've studied the other countries, and that's my considered position, and I'll present the reasons for it. Or if China has got the most rapid growth of any major country in human history, that's not an exaggerated statement, it's because I've looked at the growth record of what the other countries are, and I know it's an objective statement. What is this about? This is a contemptible attempt, which I find disgusting, for some people to try to break China's confidence in itself. Looked at from outside, the situation is crazy. The danger in China should be excessive arrogance. It might be necessary for friends from outside to say, well, please, there are still a lot of problems and difficulties, and don't get carried away, because China's achievements are so enormous, right? But instead, we have a lack of self-confidence. I'm not just saying it by individual people. I'm talking this is discussed in the Chinese media. What is the reason for this? And it relates to what I think is one of the most inspiring statements that I've ever read, and which was a statement which echoed around the entire world. These were the immortal words of Mao Zedong in 1948, that China has stood up. Now, what does this mean? And why did everybody in the world understand this statement? He didn't say, China will now have a rapid rate of economic growth. He didn't say, China will improve its health service. He didn't even say China will now distribute land to the peasants, all of which were very good, right? He said China has stood up, by which he means China has stood up in every single way, in its economic way, in its social way, in its cultural way, in its psychological way. It has no desire to be better than anybody else, and it is not going to accept that it's 1% less good than anybody else either. And do you know why people understood that? Because there were many, many other people in the world who felt the same thing. There were the people, black people in South Africa who were under apartheid. There were people in Latin America who'd been invaded, and they wanted to stand up also. And the reason that those words were so much was because somebody has stood up. And more importantly, the biggest country in the entire world has stood up. And that's going to change the situation which exists in the world. Latin America was another example. They were trampled on for 100 years. Every time there was somebody progressive in America, they were trampled on. They had lack of self-confidence. What China did was it changed the situation in the world by those words. And it's changed it, of course. It's not merely enough to say China has stood up in a psychological sense. Then you do have to distribute land to the peasants, make the economy grow, build a health service, and all these other boring types of things. Well, they're not boring, sorry, I shouldn't say that. They're incredibly important things, but the ones that are not captured, they've all got to be done, and they are being done. What does it mean? And this is why I want to come back to what a privilege it is to speak here, and I want to try to convince you that what I was saying was not just to be polite. China has its national rejuvenation within its grasp. Nobody from the outside can defeat China. That is the great achievement of the situation since 1949. There's going to be no Japanese invasion, no crazy US neocon wants a war. Only China's lack of self-confidence, only China solving its own problems, not solving its own problems, will prevent China's national rejuvenation. If it doesn't do that, the price they will pay will be merciless. I will not end my life very happily. History, the great German philosopher Hegel explained that at a certain point in time, a certain country represented not only its own interests, but the representatives of the whole of humanity. If we take European history, in the 16th century, Holland made the first successful capitalist revolution in the world. Holland is a tiny country, but this represented such a step forward from the point of liberation of humanity that people were still writing about this centuries later, and it inspired people. In 1776, the United States broke with Britain to create what became the most powerful country in the world. The United States was the most important country at that time, or what was going to become the United States. 1789, the Great French Revolution took place, which transformed the whole of Europe. With France was the key, not only to France, but to the situation of humanity. In 1917, a great revolution took place in Russia that led not merely the Russian people forward and protected their country for decades, but was responsible for the destruction of the colonial empires and set up a process of liberation, and of course had a gigantic effect inside China. The Chinese Communist Party would not have existed and began its origins. It's true that, of course, then Chinese Communist Party had to develop its own ideas and to integrate Marxism with China, etc. But it only existed because in 1917 the Russian people stood up, if we want to take Chairman Mao's expression, and took power. And that revolution was incredibly positive. Now, from the reasons I've explained in this, the decisive place in the entire world is China. For objective reasons I've tried to explain it. Say not to be polite, I mean it totally seriously, and I can understand why. But again, I want to explain what it means. It does not mean that what China should think about now is the interests of everybody else. Please think about the interests of other people a little bit. But nevertheless, that's not the important thing. It is that China's own national rejuvenation is not only the key to the development of China, it is the key step that can be taken today in the rejuvenation of the whole of humanity. And it takes a great task, because the thing I've tried to explain to you is how powerful and how ruthless are the people outside who want to stop this. China has many friends in the world, but it also has some powerful and dangerous enemies. And what I want above all, and it relies upon the young people here, is for China to be powerful enough that it can be friends with the many people in the world who want to be friends with China, and it can be strong enough to defeat its enemies who have only bad intentions, not only towards China, but towards the rest of the world. And if I've explained some of that tonight, I'd be very happy indeed. Thank you.